For you tonight, Daisy Cooper is Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, MP for St Albans. Sitting to my left is Lord Stephen Greenhalgh, Conservative peer and former Home Office Minister. Adam Payne is making his debut on the programme. No pressure, Adam. He's political editor of PoliticsHome. And Justin Urquhart-Stewart is business commentator and co-founder of the Regionally Investment Platform. We're awaiting your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text your question to 850, or you can even use Alexa. Just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and then just say your question. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Andrew in Hounslow. What is the burning issue of the night in Hounslow, Andrew?
Hi, Ian. I'd just like to ask the panel, do they think it's time we elected the House of Lords through proportional representation, and that way minority parties could get a handle in there and everybody would feel as though their vote counted for something?
Interestingly, that wasn't part of Keir Starmer's proposals today. He didn't even talk about how any new peers or senators or whatever they would be called would be elected. Daisy Cooper, I think I can probably guess your answer to this one, so let's start with you.
The answer is a big fat yes. I mean, the Liberal Democrats...
It would have been news if you'd said no.
Not quite. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have been talking about these kind of issues for a very long time. And so I'm pleased to see that the Labour Party is catching up in that respect and talking about some of these issues. Yes, of course, we need to have an elected House of Lords. Yes, we need all sorts of other reforms as well. Liberal Democrats have long supported having a federal Britain, but the big gaping hole in the proposals that we heard today was around proportional representation. And I think if we are serious about making sure that every single vote matters, then it's important that we do have a fairer form of votes so that whichever party takes over in future, they have a real mandate to deliver for everybody on whether it's health, education, social care or anything else.
But of course, you say proportional representation, that covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it? I mean, you could either have it done on a constituency basis, probably fairly big constituencies. You could do it on a regional basis. You can do it on a national basis. Has your party come up with proposals on that?
Well, I think if you put 5 Liberal Democrats in a room, you'd have 6 different views on what form of PR we might have. But we're certainly working on it. It's one of our favourite debates to have. But quite frankly, I think any form of PR is better than the current system that we currently have.
Justin Urquhart-Stewart, Keir Starmer said, and Gordon Brown both said today, that they thought the sclerotic parliamentary system is one of the reasons why we have such low growth in this country, which I did scratch my head a bit on that one. Before we get to proportional representation, what do you think about that?
I can't see how those things are connected at all. It's very odd indeed. No, question, as you've been talking before on the programme, do you actually need a second chamber? The answer is yes, you do. So what sort of chamber do you want? The original idea of it was to actually provide a checking facility. And what you need to do is bring that up to date. So whether it's actually by proportional representation or actually just making sure you're getting the right people there. The problem is by voting people in, you're actually going to be missing out on some really intelligent, bright people you'd want to have in there who don't necessarily want to actually go through we wouldn't get hold of through the normal electoral process.
Well, you're right, but I can think of a lot of bright people who are not in the House of Lords who I'd quite like to see in the House of Lords, but then I'm not Prime Minister and I can't use patronage to appoint them.
So now we have to find another way of trying to encourage those people to be in it. We need that knowledge and sense to actually countermand what's coming out of the Commons, particularly at the moment when you look at some of the quality of legislation. It's not very good.
Or maybe the House of Lords is failing in its duty then.
Yeah, well, that's a good point.
If it's not amending and revising in the way that it used to, maybe it now isn't fit for purpose.
Well, when you've got the size it is, this bloated beast, full of a lot of people who don't seem to be doing a great deal, hone that down to people who need what we want there and actually make sure they're properly rewarded for doing so. It's £300 a day, whatever. But nonetheless, I've always been a great person in Singapore for a long time. And in Singapore, we have a great idea. We pay the politicians a huge amount of money, and that way you don't get much corruption.
How much?
I can't remember the details offhand, but you can need more than double what MP are getting now.
Adam Payne, what is the likelihood of this actually happening? Because, of course, Tony Blair in 1997, with a majority of 179, he couldn't make it happen in his government. So Keir Starmer's unlikely, I would have thought, to get that kind of majority. How can he be confident that he could push this through?
Well, and another key point is that the ideas set out today by Keir Starmer and Gordon Brown are ideas. They're not guaranteed to make it into the Labour manifesto. So I think what's useful about a consultation is you can put out some ideas, sort of spend the next few weeks and months seeing how they land, And then the ones that do land well, you don't think are going to be electorally difficult for you can put in your manifesto. The ones that you think, that didn't...
But how many people decide their vote on House of Lords reform? Very few, I would have thought.
Well, exactly. And, it's part of a wider package. When it was unveiled today, it's part of a wider package about, Keir Starmer argued that politics in this country is too centralised. There's not enough power in the regions, in localities. It's part of that wider package. As you said, this was something that was talked about in the 90s. So and also there is some lack of clarity around the details, right? So although Keir Starmer has said he'd like to do this in his first term as Prime Minister, that's not a concrete commitment as things stand. And also there is some vagueness around the details of what this elected chamber would look like, as you said, Iain, in your introductory remarks. It could mean all sorts of things to all sorts of people. So whether this makes it into the Labour manifesto remains to be seen. Keir Starmer, although he's doing very well in the polls, he's still incredibly cautious in regards to what he's prepared to commit to, and we saw that in regards to Brexit. Perhaps we'll talk about that later on. So how likely is it? I'd personally be surprised if it made it into the 2024.
And what about the question of PR, which Andrew wants to know about?
Well, Keir Starmer came under a lot of pressure, didn't he, at Labour conference back in September to back a motion tabled by Labour delegates calling for PR.
No, that went through, didn't it?
It did, but then, in terms of whether the Leader of Opposition, his office, accept it, they haven't accepted it. If it didn't accept it back in September when it was passed at conference, I don't see what's going to change his mind.
Because it is possible to oppose PR for the House of Commons, but support it for the House of Lords, isn't it? I mean, I know you'd want Daisy PR for everything, including parish councils probably as well. But I don't think that it's necessarily one thing or the other. I could imagine supporting PR for local government, for example, where you've got lots of one-party states, which are, I think, quite lazy, corrupt in some cases. PR would do something about that, wouldn't it?
It absolutely would. And PR, any form of PR, quite frankly, is better than first past the post. I think what we have in this country are huge swathes of people right across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right to everybody in between, who do not feel like their vote actually matters. And on that basis, they decide not to vote at all, or they decide to vote for the least worst option. And if you want to engage people in a healthy democracy, what a rubbish choice that is. Any form of PR would improve that situation. So yes, I would like to see PR, and I'd like to see it right across the political spectrum, every level of government.
It's about time we came to the one member of the House of Lords that we have on the panel.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
Stephen, I know you're gagging to answer this question.
Well, no, it's quite hard to argue against reform, and there does need to be reform of the upper chamber. We've got to work out, as Justin mentioned, what it's there for, and it's essentially a revising chamber, and for that you do need expertise. You need very bright people, and I was struck when we took through the Building Safety Act, and we had to get, essentially support through amendment from all parties. And the law lords would say, at the point at which it was going to infringe property rights, and you'd get a speech from a law lord that never was going to stand for election, and they knew their stuff. And I think, the criticism of having a bloated house is absolutely right. It's far too big. There are people who've never made speeches at all that I've met, which is ridiculous. I've been a minister until July, and I've started making speeches as a backbencher. I intend to get involved in things that I'm passionate about. I want to be a parliamentarian. I'm happy to stand for election. I used to be elected. But the question is, let's focus on what the objective is.
How long have you been a member of the House of Lords?
About 2 years and a bit.
And when you first went in,
it was COVID.
Were your preconceptions? I see that probably has coloured it. But were your preconceptions confirmed, or have you become more impressed by it?
I wanted to become a minister when I was first given the opportunity to serve, because that's, for me, important public service. And but when I've grown to love the House of Lords, because you do meet phenomenal people, otherwise would not be contributing. So when we were debating some of the legislation that's bringing through, you had Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who's in his 90s, but brilliant man, brilliant lawyer, still contributing. You had George Young, who'd brought from some of the the housing legislation in the 1980s still contributing. You had greats from the Blair government still contributing. So admittedly that does mean I'm sort of painting a picture of a retirement home for politicians, but
that's its image, isn't it? That's the problem.
Okay. Well, look, I think that we do need to reform it, but let's not lose all of the things that are good about it.
But if there were elections for it,
Yeah.
do you agree with Andrew that these elections should be held through proportional representation?
I've always been first past the postman myself. I was in Hammersmith Fulham. I had a career built on a solid foundation of failure, 10 years in opposition, looking for the shot to win. And we won in 2006, we won by a landslide, and we won again in 2010. And I stepped down. You can be long periods in opposition, but if you have a clarity of mission, you can persuade
The House of Lords doesn't need a clarity of mission, does it? It just needs to do what it's supposed to.
Well, I think proportional representation, sorry, I forgot, I wasn't sure, I thought you were talking in general.
No, for the House of Lords.
For the House of Lords, sorry, then I missed, yeah. I think for the House of Lords, that is, what you want to get is what you used to have actually in the 18th and 19th centuries. You want the whole of the country represented. And with the old landowners, pre-industrialisation, that's what you had. So we've got to find a way of ensuring you get the talents from the whole of our four nations. That's the objective. And if PR delivers that for you, I'm open to that.
Why can't we actually you break it up into different parts? Because some people aren't going to get elected, but they're really expert in their field. I mean, at the moment we have the bishops.
Well, so keep 20% maybe of seats free for appointed.
Yes, what percentage would be.
How do you justify that, though?
Well, it's going to be really difficult, but at the moment, it's a really bad way of going about it because it's the Prime Minister's going brace and favour to whoever he feels guilty about. And that's not the right way of going about it. We end up with a whole House of Lords we don't really respect. And people look at it and say, what's it ever done for us? Well, it's not dealing with the Romans anymore, but...
I think we need to bust this myth that the only reason we've got good people in the House of Lords is because they're not elected. And look at the House of Commons, right? You've got a huge variety of people in the House of Commons, and every single one of us is elected. There are some people who have real expertise in their particular area, either because they've developed it before they got elected, or because they developed it whilst being in the chamber as a member of Parliament. There are those who work incredibly hard. There are those that arguably work less hard, but there's real variety.
Name them.
No reason, not at all. There's no reason at all why you couldn't find good people who are experts in their field, who care about democracy and want to play their role in the House of Lords. And it's incumbent on every single political party to go out and find those people. I don't think anybody should be afraid of standing for election if they want to play their role in our democracy.
Can I just come with just two quick points here? Firstly, we've been talking about this for like 5 minutes, and it's become clear already how complex, how complicated, how many different views there are and what form this could take. And if Labour does win the next election, right now, you'd say that's probably going to happen, but 2 years is a long time. You look at the number of the issues this Labour government's going to have to deal with and the magnitude of those issues. Is it going to have the time and the bandwidth to have the conversation we're having and to implement something? Perhaps that's why Keir Starmer's picking his language quite carefully about first term, second term. And Daisy, you talked about, who sits in the House of Commons, and in light of MPs announcing they're not going to stand at the next election, the likes of Sajid Javid confirming he's not going to stand, there is a conversation happening now about whether Westminster has a problem getting talented people into the House of Commons and retaining them. And I guess that is linked to the conversation about the sorts of people we want to have in our Parliament making decisions for us.
Sure, well, think about it. Being an MP is a huge honour, but it's a role that comes with no power and no leverage and not really any resources. It's all about influence and discussion and debate. If we can actually disperse power around the UK in a way that I would love to see, in the way that Liberal Democrats have talked about for a very, very long time, you have mayors, you have local authorities, you give them power and resources. I think you'd find incredibly talented people from right around the UK wanting to get elected to those local positions where they can really make a change in their own communities.
OK, we'll move on to another question in just a moment. It's 8:15.
LBC Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Mark has sent in an email saying, on this evening's programme, I heard you say you'd like to see PR in local government. Guess what? In Scotland, that's exactly what we have. 3 or 4 member wards in each of our 32 local authorities. OK, it still results in backroom deals and rainbow coalitions, but at least it means every vote counts. One day you might catch up with us south of the border. Just to make that, I was aware that Scotland and Wales and indeed Northern Ireland have PR in local elections. This idea that not every vote counts in a first-past-the-post election, I've never, ever bought into that. I know, Daisy, you'll totally disagree with me on that. But every vote does count. It just means that somebody gets more votes than another one, and so therefore the losing candidate thinks that all of their votes doesn't count. Go on, 30 seconds.
There are too many seats around the country where they are safe seats.
Only because more people vote for the candidate who wins.
Sure, but the people who vote for the other parties that probably have no chance of winning, their vote doesn't count for anything at all, so they could have 2,000 more votes.
Well, then they need to persuade the voters of the error of their ways.
The fact of the matter is that first past the post...
No, you're knocking the table now.
First past the post skews the system, and different forms of PR give a fairer vote, a fairer system, and gives everybody a say.
Right, let's move on to something completely different. Martin's in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Ian and panel. Yeah, my question is the Chester by-election a good indicator for the next election?
Is the Chester by-election a good indicator of the next election? Adam Payne.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to put a supplementary onto that and saying, is any by-election a good indicator of the next election?
That's you're sort of setting up what I was going to say. I think that, let's sort of unpack the question. Is Labour on course to win the next election? And forget about the by-election bit. Right now, as I said earlier, they're probably going to win the next election. They've got 20% plus leads in the polls. They're leading the Tories on most issue-based questions. And you look at the next 2 years and where Rishi Sunak perhaps could turn it around in a big way. If there don't seem to be many obvious opportunities for the Prime Minister given the economic conditions, but again, Ian, it's 2 years away.
There is slightly going off the subject here, but let me give you one way. If by middle of 2024 the Bank of England is right and that inflation has come down to between 2 and 3%, Rishi Sunak could turn around and say, you stuck with me, I stuck with you, we've done it, we've got inflation back down, interest rates are back down. Don't let the others ruin it.
Well, I was about to say that 2 years is a long time, and while the backdrop is bleak, at the moment things can change. If we can only hope that the situation in Ukraine, there is a more positive outcome there, and that could have an effect on the global economy, global supply chains, that sort of thing. So Labour are guaranteed to win the next election, but right now you'd say they're hot favourites. The recent by-election in Chester, I think I'm right in saying that the result pretty much reflected where the national polling is, so we can say that that's something in itself. But it's not... I don't think Chester... When you look at by-elections and constituencies right around the country and you're thinking about which are the most indicative, which tell us the most about the state of the parties, I don't think Chester you'd put on the top shelf of the most revealing by-elections.
Got no coverage, did it?
Well, and I don't think the Tories tried enormously hard in their campaigning there. If I was thinking about if there is a by-election which tells us quite a lot, which can be quite illuminating, I'd perhaps look at a seat in the so-called Red Wall where the Tories are currently the occupants and Labour in second. I'd look at something like that. For example, a shameless plug for my hometown, but I'm from Barrow-in-Furness. That went blue in 2019. The MP there, Simon Fell, has a majority of about a few thousand. If there was a by-election in Barrow tomorrow, for example, I'd be looking really closely at that result. Chester...
And that seat does have a habit of producing surprise results. I remember one of the first MPs I ever met in 1983 when you weren't even thought of, I imagine.
What year?
1983.
Very much not. No.
I remember in July 1983 going for a drink on the terrace of the House of Commons with the MP that I'd been working for in Norwich. And this other MP came up and sat down and he looked like a very unhappy Vince Cable. And that's how Vince Cable normally looks, obviously. But, and I said, what's wrong with you? He said, well, I never wanted to be here. I didn't think I was going to win. And I think he was there for the next 8 years.
Yeah, and Barrow is, in US politics, as a term used, like a bellwether.
Yeah.
A place where the result in a particular area could go a long way to reflecting the national result, the wider result. And Barrow is probably one of those places. I won't describe Chester,
No.
as a bellwether, unless anyone else on the panel disagrees. I wouldn't.
Well, actually, to be fair, it is one of those seats that if there's a Conservative government, it tends to be a Conservative seat, and if there's a Labour government, it tends to be a Labour seat, but not all the time.
I was going to say 2019, Labour managed to keep hold of it despite such a big swing towards the Tories.
The Liberal Democrats didn't do particularly well in Chester, did they? Is that an indication of your electoral fortunes, Daisy Cooper?
Well, our share of the vote went up.
I
think it was around 8%
Well done.
And but the reason for that, our vote went up because we had a fantastic candidate who was campaigning for a better deal for Chester, but also it showed that there were a number of disaffected former lifelong Conservative voters who didn't want to vote Conservative anymore and didn't want to vote Labour, and so they changed.
Well, they
their
did
vote
vote Labour. They clearly did. Look at the majority.
Some Conservative voters switched to voting Labour.
More went to Labour than went to you, quite clearly.
Sure, it's a Labour-facing seat, but on the same night, there were also by-elections in Surrey, in the Blue Wall, and Liberal Democrats won those 2 by-elections incredibly well, including one in Jeremy Hunt's seat.
Stephen Greenhalgh, what do you take from the Chester result? Martin, I think I'm correct in interpreting, thinks that it's more proof, and Adam confirmed this, that Labour are set to win.
Well, I think by and large I'd agree with them. They're set to win, but don't we all remember elections where that still didn't happen?
1992.
I was thinking 92, but I was, and I just feel this feels more like it could be a 92 than a 97. And there's we're just barely past midterm. 2 years is a long time, and I think we're going to run the full Parliament, and a lot can happen. So I think it's all to play for, but at the moment, it doesn't look very good.
Okay, well, there's honesty for you, Justin.
Oh, remember the one word that runs an economy is confidence. So people haven't got any confidence at the moment after what's happened over the past year. If you can spend the next 2 years rebuilding some confidence by saying, actually, things start improving now. The problem is that the communication, I find, from a lot of government is very, very poor. You look at, for example, even during the Osborne years, when they were trying to close the deficit, they did close the deficit. So to the extent that actually if you took off the interest they were paying, which is 50 billion, actually they had started to balance the books. Did anyone say that in a way which people said, oh, that's a good idea, that's great, well done you? So they could turn it around if they start bringing back the confidence, get the economy growing again. I know one keeps on that phrase, but it's important.
And they've actually got to go out there and spread a message, haven't they? And that's the problem. Even though we've had, how many prime ministers have we had over the past few years now? But all of their media, I don't know if you find this, Adam, on the print side, well, you're not print, you're internet, but on the broadcast side, it's like getting blood out of a stone. The government makes a big announcement and you give them the opportunity to come on your programme to sort of sell their wares. No one's available.
And what's interesting is recently Downing Street's taken a decision to, because as you know, Ian, usually up until recently, the government will put a minister on the media round every morning. To stop doing that recently. There are reasons why we took that decision. Someone in Downing Street put it to me that it's because they reached a point when those media rounds ended up being not that helpful to them. Someone would come up with a gaffe, or because there was so much scandal.
We'll put better people up then.
But however, what it means is when Labour is, going out this morning making a major announcement, there's no minister on shows like LBC's or BBC or Sky or whatever, making the counter argument. So it does create a bit of a vacuum when the opposition can step in and.
Yeah, because I always say to them, who do you think is going to sell your policy if you don't do it? Because there isn't anyone else who's going to do it. And if you don't put a minister up, then the likelihood is that we will get an opposition spokesperson to put in their place, because that's the way it works, I'm afraid. But you might as well be talking to yourself. I've gone through all of you, haven't I? Let's go on to Martin, thank you. Let's go to another question. Ben is in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian, and good evening, panel. Yeah, the RMT union leader says the offer would mean the loss of thousands of jobs and the implementation of unsound practices. And another union leader says get more strings than a harp, this offer. So what does the panel think about that?
Well, let's bring you up to date. If you've only just tuned into the programme, the RMT have confirmed that their strikes are going to go ahead. They've rejected the offer that the government made over the week. Well, I say the government, the employers. That was a slip of the tongue, wasn't it? The employers made over the weekend. And they're not only going to go ahead with the existing strikes, they've added another one from the 24th to the 27th of December. But most trains don't run then anyway, I suppose. Stephen Greenhalgh, this dispute, I thought that they were edging together And all the smoke signals were that there might be some sort of agreement, but clearly things have taken a different turn. Why do you think that is?
Well, clearly the employers want a reform tempo that the RMT don't accept, and they recognise that in order to make the rail network work and be sustainable, they've got to change practices, and the union's not moving fast enough. And it's not just the strikes, Ian. I mean, now I've lost my ministerial car, I have to take the train far more often. It's the cancellations. I know your heart bleeds, but no, absolutely. But no, seriously, it's actually the way strikes are called off at the 11th hour. So effectively, they say we're not on strike, but then the whole day, the next day, actually results in unrest. So it's a disruption. It's the public I actually feel for in all of this, obviously.
But the public are actually quite supportive of these strikes.
I'm not sure they are, actually. I don't know.
We tested it out the other day because at the beginning of these strikes, I had a fairly, shall we say, robust interview with Mick Lynch, and I assumed that most of the people phoning in would support my line. Oh no, they supported him. And then
it's qualitative,
a couple of
it's just people ringing in. It's not polling or data.
But it's not data, but you can get a reasonably good indication of the number of calls that come in and what the callers are saying. And we repeated it a couple of weeks ago and said, do you still support the RMT in the way that you did at the beginning of this? We didn't have a single person phoning in saying no.
I have an interest as a director of a business. We had our Christmas party, but 50 people, most of whom train it in. It gets cancelled, has to be brought forward. If you poll them now, the amount of disruption they're going through, they're certainly not supportive of it. Well, we can all point to something to say, the public are this or that. I just don't agree with that, Ian. I don't think they're supportive of this.
Jackie Smith and I have just had to cancel our live For the Many podcast event on the 17th because that's a strike day. Now, I've got no idea what proportion of the audience were coming in from outside London, but we thought, well, we can't just go ahead. So that is going to affect the London economy. Okay,
it is.
Sort of 300 people coming at that, but you might say, well, that's not. But that will be multiplied over all sorts of different industries, won't it, Justin?
Well, this is one of the problems you've got, because the main argument with this, you can see why people are sympathetic with it. You've got double-digit inflation, and I'm being offered 2%.
Well, they're being offered 4% this year and 4% next year.
I'm generalising. Everyone else is potentially in dispute. A much, much lower level. And it's quite obvious, because everybody knows they can see the prices going up. And particularly for the poorer end of society, that's where they've actually seen those very significant costs. So it's a message which, to most people, they would understand in terms of they're not being paid enough compared to what's going on. This is where they're missing a trick. You separate out a peak of inflation, which is going to last a year, maybe 18 months, and you do have a deal whereby there's an inflation payment. We did this back in the 80s. But you separate out that from the pay negotiations, which allows that to carry on at a relatively steady level. That means you avoid this issue about having to say, well, we're not going to be paying you 14, 15%, whatever it happens to be. The pay level carries on, but there is a separate payment for inflation for that year.
Interesting.
And one thing which seems to be missing from this debate, and I can't believe the government and the employers aren't making more of this, is that the revenues on the railways have gone down by 20% because of COVID, and they haven't recovered. So, I mean, that's something that I think the union might find it difficult to counter. Adam, where do you see this going? Ben wants to know, if it isn't about money, what is it about?
Well, I think, Ian, just to come back to your point, you talked about how you were surprised by how much support you felt that the unions had. And I think it's because in this particular episode of industrial action, it's not just the rail workers. You have, I think, nurses, you have firefighters who potentially going to go on strike.
Well, there's a whole raft of them.
It's people across
at the moment.
Society. So it's not unique to particular, industry, particular professions. So perhaps that explains why there is a high degree of widespread support that perhaps you didn't expect. And I think the issue for the government is, perhaps in the past, the general public, when asked, have blamed the unions for this, for when they can't get a train or what have you. But the issue for the government, I think, is the government is blamed for this because of things like inflation and the cost of living crisis, which is, why the unions say they're going on strike, is something that everyone's feeling. So I think the danger for the government, and it comes into this wider discussion about the government just being unpopular at the moment, is that they're blamed for the chaos. I think it was announced earlier, Mick Lynch said that they're looking to go on strike on dates closer to Christmas, and clearly that is going to potentially cause more disruption to people. It will feel more personal because a lot of people are travelling, or like for me as well, I'm going back up north on, hopefully, on the 21st, 22nd, 23rd. And I guess it'll be interesting to see if, in light of this announcement in the last hour or so, whether that changes public opinion, whether the people think that striking this close to Christmas is perhaps a step too far.
Yeah.
I think it remains to be seen.
Daisy, very quickly if we can.
Well, I think Adam's nailed it. I mean, the fact is that this is on the government, isn't it? The government has spent, all the summer months basically stuck in its internal wranglings and its leadership contest, not talking to the unions and trying to find a deal. Contests, that's it, plural, quite. And I think it was a Liberal Democrat question that exposed the fact that the Transport Minister hadn't even met with the unions for an entire month in the run up to the June strikes.
Mark Harper has done, but fat lot of good it's done him.
Well, quite. I think the position we're in at the moment is that this is a cry for help from a lot of people. And as Adam said, I think up and down the country, everybody to some degree or another is feeling the cost of living crisis. And I think because people are feeling it themselves, they understand that people on the front line, whether that's in the NHS, in social care or in the rail system, they recognise that other people are struggling as well. So it's on the government to step up and try and resolve this through negotiations as quickly as possible.
Ben, thank you very much. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:33 news headlines with Tim Daly.
Rail workers have announced further strike action over Christmas. The RMT union says the extra walkouts will take place from 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve until Tuesday the 27th of December, after a pay rise of 8% over 2 years was rejected. Sir Keir Starmer says plans to redistribute power from Westminster to local authorities are a blueprint for a new Britain. The Labour leader's proposals include abolishing the House of Lords. And a primary school pupils become the 8th child to die with a strep A infection this winter. The UK Health and Security Agency says it's working with staff at Moorlands Primary School in Hampshire. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 11 points at 75.67. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.15. LBC weather, a mixture of cloud and clear spells for many of us overnight, with showers blowing into northern Scotland and a low of -1 degree.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:37 on LBC. Our panel this evening, Stephen Greenhalgh, Adam Payne, Justin Urquhart-Stewart and Daisy Cooper. Now, Daisy, you may have to depart to do your democratic duty and vote. What are you voting on tonight?
Online harms bill.
Right, that's actually quite an important one, isn't it?
It is.
Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Dave in Faversham. Do the panel think that nurses should take a real terms pay cut to send a message to Vladimir Putin? You may think that's a ridiculous question. If you haven't heard the news that the Conservative Party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, has been accused of insulting NHS workers with a, quote, ludicrous suggestion that it's the wrong time to strike over low pay because it would help Vladimir Putin divide the West. Adam Payne.
Interestingly, so this morning when we had our morning session with the Prime Minister's spokesperson and we asked them questions about what the PM thinks, and this morning the PM spokesperson was asked if the PM would like to support the words of Nadhim Zahawi, and interestingly they didn't take up that invitation to do so. I mean, it was I think Nadhim Zahawi was slaughtered on social media, wasn't it, after he said that. He was accused of being crass and for saying something that was ridiculous. Perhaps this is why Number 10 has decided to ditch the morning media.
Because that is the sort of thing that all of the different interviewers, of course, all the radio and TV stations, that they would ask the questions that sort of on the issue of the day, but that would be slipped in at the end, wouldn't it? And it's a difficult one for if you got collective responsibility. You may think it's crass, but you can't say so.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, because and this was particularly in the Johnson and Truss years towards the end, where it just felt like scandal was, or the government was constantly in crisis, ministers would be asked to go on, like LBC and others, and defend something ridiculous that their colleague has said the previous day. And it got to the point where ministers just towards the end, when discipline broke down, just refused to go on shows because they didn't want to look like Muppets.
And it was all left to 3 or 4 people who I described as the ministers for sticky wickets, because they could be trusted to play a straight bat, sort of Brandon Lewis.
I remember Grant Shapps.
I mean, actually, Nadhim Zahawi was one of them as well.
Good.
Yeah. Stephen, it's a bit of an embarrassment, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I think to say Nadhim's normally a really sure-footed person when he does media. He's a plain speaker. He's got a strong business background. He's now an experienced politician. But, sometimes you say stuff that you, on the spur of the moment, doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're all guilty of it. But, that's not the man that I know. And he's obviously made an error, and we've just got to move on. We've got important fish to fry and an economy to salvage. Don't worry about this.
Let's move on to Daisy.
I mean, not only is it completely ludicrous, but it's actually really insulting, isn't it? If you think about what nurses have been through over the last couple of years, being on the front line without PPE whilst the government wasted billions on it. There's 1 in 4 hospitals now have food banks for nurses and other NHS staff. 2/3 of nurses are earning less than the national average salary of $32,000, and to somehow say that they're, giving weight or credence to Putin's war, I mean, it's just really insulting. So I'm not surprised that no one's been out there to defend it.
Justin?
I just like the idea that actually Putin might need some nurses, so possibly there's an opportunity for them to go and earn some more there, looking after him as he's fallen down the stairs last week in a rather uncomfortable manner.
I haven't read that. Where did you hear that?
That was an unfortunate issue.
Websites.
Yes, one of those, no doubt. Very reliable
ones. I told you about that in the past. Right, Dave, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's move on to Keith in Upminster. Hello, Keith.
Hello, Ian. Good evening.
Hi. What would you like to ask?
Football may be coming home, but what's the chances of a professional football player coming out before the end of the season or before the end of the World Cup?
Daisy, let's go to you first in case you have to go and vote.
Yeah, I mean, close to zero, right? I'll be honest, I don't think FIFA should have ever awarded the World Cup to Qatar. I think it was completely the wrong thing to do. Football is supposed to bring people together.
I don't want to go into that argument again. We've covered that so much on the programme. But in terms of why do you think it is that male footballers do not come out, whereas on the female side of the game, I mean, I don't know how many there are in the England team, but there are several gay footballers in the England women's team, one of whom has just won I'm a Celebrity. It doesn't done her any harm, has it?
I don't think it does anybody any harm, but I think the two things are linked, right?
But the agents probably think it does. I suspect that if a footballer told his agent that he was going to come out as gay, the agent would say, well, you're going to risk $500,000 because your sponsors will desert you. I actually think it's the opposite. I think they'll get more sponsors. But you can see how the argument would go.
So the question, as I understood it, was what are the chances of somebody coming out before the end of this World Cup? So I do think it is intrinsically linked to this World Cup. Sponsorship absolutely should not go up or down depending on any part of your identity. We are a welcoming, inclusive country, and anybody who wants to come out should feel able to do so in our society. The chances of it happening before the end of this World Cup in Qatar, where people can be sort of criminalised or put to death because of their identity of being LGBT, I think is disgraceful. And I think FIFA should never have awarded Qatar the World Cup for that reason.
It would be quite nice, though, because there are clearly quite a few Premiership footballers who are not in the England team that could choose now to come out. It would be quite symbolic if they did during the World Cup, wouldn't it? But like you, I'm not expecting it to happen.
I'm not expecting it to happen either, but were it to happen, I would think that person would be unbelievably brave, and I would be incredibly proud, even more proud of our football team for doing something like that.
Justin.
I think it's such an important issue. Here at the moment where actually there's never had such publicity with a country which is seen to be so intractable and not forgiving in this subject. Here is an opportunity for footballers to be able to come out and say, actually, yes, I am, so what? And particularly at Qatar as well, to actually just sort of say, I don't care what you think. This is who I am and what I stand for. And even also the players who aren't. Because you actually put it in the right box. It doesn't matter. You know, you're my chum.
Adam.
Do you know what? I think that in the last few years, I'm a big football fan. I think in the last few years, and I think Gareth Southgate and this England team has been a big contributor to, I think, in football, we are having conversations about LGBT, about women's rights, about social issues that weren't happening. So I do actually think we've come a long way in the last few years. But there are so few top-flight footballers who have come out. I don't know off the top of my head. And, do you know, when I was playing football and rugby when I was younger, just looking back in that changing room, although I enjoyed it, I made great friends.
Steady.
Would I have felt comfortable coming out in that environment? Absolutely not. I probably would have been terrified.
But the end of a career, the end of a competition.
Yes. But I'll be at the point, I go to football quite a lot, and although I said we have come a long way in the game in the last few years, sadly you can still go to games and hear people in the crowd shout appalling things. So I still think there is a culture in male football that's been around for a long time in this country which hasn't improved enough for male players to feel comfortable to come out.
I'm just trying to think, as a lad from Barrow who you support.
Well,
please don't say Manchester United. A bit of me will die.
I resent you for asking that. So I do support the Barrow rugby team. I'm actually a Liverpool fan, but I do go and watch Barrow football when they're in London, and so I'm not.
Liverpool's acceptable.
Yeah.
Stephen.
Well, I think the positive thing is that the younger you are, the more likely it is that you'll feel comfortable to do that. I mean, I talked to my two boys and my daughter that loved the game. I used to play rugby, and they all seem to hate rugby. None of them do rugby. They all play football, and they just don't care what your sexuality is. They're very happy, and in fact, they know that they're playing with people that are clearly gay. It doesn't matter within that context. But the older you get, it's the changing room culture that's the concern. And I think, but the direction of travel is positive, and I'm sure someone will come out, but it may not be this World Cup.
Well, we are going to send Daisy out of the studio because she has to go and vote. So we're going to be an all-male panel, for which I profusely apologise for the last quarter of the programme. Not my fault. Daisy, thank you very much indeed. Right, we'll come to more questions in just a moment. It's 8:46.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:48 on LBC. Daisy Cooper has had to depart to vote in the House of Commons, for which we don't blame her at all, because I suppose this could be construed as a second job appearing on this programme, couldn't it? He says in a radio link to the next question. It's a text question from Mary in Lancaster. I went full on Partridge there, didn't I? Is it ever acceptable for an MP to have a regular second job? Adam, let's start with you. This is a really thorny issue, isn't it?
It's a thorny issue, and we were chatting just now before we came back on it about how it really sort of exploded into life, as a story. Was it last year, the year before, with Geoffrey Cox? And it's something that, as part of this package that Keir Starmer announced today, he wants to sort of clean up politics and restore integrity, as he describes it. And one of the things he's put forward as part of his consultation is banning most second jobs. I think the second jobs he will be allowed if Starmer becomes PM. Is it ones that genuinely boost your, or that's sort of relevant to your work as an MP? I think there's something like that. What interests me in with this is that, you said earlier that House of Lords reform, doesn't come up on the doorsteps as you go around the country. I think I agree with you. I wonder if, as part of this package of measures, whether the second jobs question has more traction with the public, is more outrageous to the public, in the same way that this idea of prime ministers giving seats in the House of Lords to their friends and people have done them favours in the same way is. So, because PoliticsHome doesn't really take an issue on these sorts of... I'm not going to comment on whether second jobs should be allowed, but I'm interested in whether that particular policy proposal is something that the general public is really interested in and gets worked up about.
But what does Adam Payne think, not PoliticsHome?
I think that I have sympathy with the argument that MPs already have incredible amounts of work to do, particularly over the last few years with coronavirus and whatnot, and cost of living crisis. And having a second job, I think, would make it harder to do the first job.
OK, Justin?
I think the job has changed. Do you think of the job description go back 30 years ago? That's why I had an awful lot of barristers who were actually there doing their bar work and then go in the evening to go and run Parliament. It's now a full-time job, or it should be a full-time job, and therefore also with it being proper pay. And some of my family live in Singapore, and they've got, in Singapore, they pay the politicians really eye-watering amounts of money on the basis
it's around £200,000 a year.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if any Prime Minister or leader of a party suggested that should happen?
Yeah,
couldn't happen, could it?
It's a complete riot on that case.
Yeah.
But the trouble is we've degraded it. It's now seen as something which is, it's not worth that much, as opposed to getting the right people in there who are very bright, very keen, and there are some very bright, keen people, but I want to attract more in. Doesn't matter which political wing you come from. But to actually say to people you're going to get a salary, which is, if you're at the low end of society, it's still quite good. If you're actually working in London, actually it's not that brilliant. So therefore, why would you?
Better than the money that peers get, though, Stephen?
Well, I was a friend of the Prime Minister, having worked for him for 4 years in City Hall, and he offered me a job as an unpaid minister, which was really hard work, actually, for the best part of 2 years and 3 months, working on issues following Grenfell as building safety and fire minister. So there's a lot of slog for not a lot of reward. But it's for me, politics has always been about public service. One of the reasons I loved local government and spent 20 years in there is I could spend the morning making money. I spent the afternoon in the town hall saving money, and then the evenings occasionally spending a bit of money. But at the end of the day, I do think it's good to have people with varied backgrounds, that they're not just careerist politicians, because you learn from doing other things and you can bring that to public service. And so I think the issue that we've got to manage is conflict of interest, and having other experiences I think makes you a better politician and public servant. So I'd be very wary of ruling it out.
Right, let's go to Adam in Leighton. Adam, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. I was going to ask, what's the panel's opinion on Michael Gove dropping mandatory house building targets in state of the Tory rebellion?
I have views on this, Adam, but I won't express them now because it's not my role.
Sorry.
The question was, what did the panel think of the decision by Michael Gove to dump mandatory house building targets? Let's start with you, Justin.
Well, I mean, the trouble is we all know that we're way behind on all of this, and we've got to do a lot more. And the problem is we're all very keen on someone building houses somewhere else. not here.
No, I'd love to build houses on my land, but I'm not allowed to.
Oh, so I think you've got to have greater flexibility. But I think you can't just say to people, right, here's your quota, you've got to fulfil it. You've actually got to take the local community with you. But there's always a balance between people who want to keep there and live in a nice, quiet village, and at the same time, we also need more houses, people. There's a whole combination of ownership here, whether it's second houses in rural areas, or whether it's people not being allowed to expand the towns. It's going to be very difficult. And I'm afraid the old green belt rules, I'm afraid, are looking very out of date.
But Michael Gove is pandering to the green belt obsessives, isn't he, here, Stephen?
I don't know. I mean, I was never a fan of these top-down targets, as, from my background in local government, so I have some sympathy with removing them. But that's not to say there shouldn't be target setting at a local level and wanting to be pro-growth. And I was a local authority leader that really did want to build. And you could look at building heavy amounts of dense housing around, for instance, the interchange at Old Oak. Thousands and thousands upon homes along the West London line, in Earl's Court, in White City. So I think you can be very pro-growth as a Conservative, but you want to have a framework that's closer to the people that are voting for that and that they see the gain. I mean, if you can have better schools, if the benefits flow with development, then I think you can get people on side. I'm not sure national targets are the answer, so I have a lot of sympathy with Michael's position. But let's make sure there's something in place at different levels of government.
If you don't have targets, particularly for rural
national governments.
Okay, but if you don't have targets, particularly for rural local authorities, the vested interests in those areas, and believe me, I know what I'm talking. I know it is true. I know what I'm talking about.
No, well, you probably do. But I know my deputy leader is now the cabinet member for planning in Wiltshire, and they're very prepared to grow. They just don't want silly formulae that give them the wrong targets. They're very pro-growth, some of these.
Some of them may be.
Well, some of them may.
The two councils I have experience and direct experience with this are shocking and just don't want to build any houses at all anywhere because they're worried what their local voters are going to think. Adam?
Well, just thinking about the politics of this, so this is a government which has an 80-seat majority, and I just think it hasn't felt like that for a while, has it? I mean, this is just one rebellion from the backbenchers that's sort of surfaced in the last few weeks. We've had the thing about onshore wind as well, which touches upon similar issues. And just some observations on that. So, it has an 80-seat majority. It doesn't feel like that. And I think that speaks to the factional and, some would argue, almost ungovernable state of the parliamentary Conservative Party at the moment. The Tory party, we've spoken a bit tonight about its prospects of the next election. This party has a big problem with millennials. And among millennials, the availability and affordability of houses is, if not the biggest issue, one of the biggest. And in light of this, I think it was broken by the Telegraph, this story about Michael Gove dropping those concrete targets. It raises questions about how the government is going to appeal to that group of people on that question. And also just what's this Conservative Party for at the moment? It doesn't really seem to be a clear, beyond an economic mission of bringing down inflation and instilling confidence that we talked about earlier. But in terms of house building, what's to me doesn't seem to be a clear sort of direction of travel on that.
We have to leave that there because we need to leave time for our final question, which is from Jason in Stanmore, who says, the public have voted for goblin mode to be the word of the year. What word would you have nominated? I've never heard of this expression. It's not a word, is it? It's a phrase, goblin mode. The definition is a type of behaviour which is unapologetically self-indulgent, lazy, slovenly or greedy, typically in a way that rejects social norms or expectations. Okay, well, I'm glad we sorted that one out. Adam, what's your word of the year?
I've never heard goblin mode.
No, I haven't.
I'd say
word of the year.
A word which has been used a hell of a lot in Westminster is febrile.
Yes.
To describe the sort of constant chaos, so I'd go with febrile.
Really, for the last 6 years. Justin?
Most of the Britain seems to be thrown under a bus this year. The buses must be incredibly bumpy. Every single newscast says, well, he's going under the bus then. Those things are words. What's the other one? We all belong to a cohort. We haven't had a cohort since the Romans left.
Very good.
Stephen?
Well, my favourite word would be oxymoron, because you can say it and it's inherently contradictory, and you can it's a nice word.
Well, mine is scunnered. We had that mentioned on the programme on Thursday. Brian Taylor, the former Scotland political editor of the BBC, mentioned it, and I thought, that's a word I'm going to adopt. And it basically means, well, I was about to use a very rude word beginning with F, ending in D, but it means you're scuppered, I suppose.
That's a better way of putting it. Okay, all right.
Sort of, I think. Anyway, it's a great word to say. Thank you all. We thank Daisy in absentia. We thank Stephen Greenhalgh, Adam Payne and Justin Urquhart-Stewart for being with us. We, of course, have another Cross Question at 8 p.m. tomorrow. If you missed any of tonight's show, you can catch up on the podcast on Global Player. Coming up in a moment, a ban on Albanians claiming protection under the Modern Slavery Act could be brought in to tackle the Channel migrant crisis. Suella Braverman is said to support plans outlined in a major report by Nick Timothy, Theresa May's former aide, published today by the Centre for Policy Studies. Well, she is Home Secretary. She could have done this in the few months that she's been Home Secretary, but hasn't. Germany's done it. Sweden's done it. They are banning all Albanians from being able to seek asylum. So why aren't we doing it? It's a question nobody has so far ever been able to answer. And would you support that? Or do you think that, no, Albanians should be allowed to apply for asylum just as anyone else should? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Transport Secretary is calling the RMT's decision to go ahead with next week's planned rail strikes and announce more over Christmas as incredibly disappointing. Mark Harper's released a statement after the union's leader, Mick Lynch, announced his members would walk out from 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve until 6 a.m. on December the 27th. That's even though he's allowing members to vote on an 8% pay offer over 2 years, which the union is recommending they reject.
There is a current of people that say that we should have a vote. We should see, what the members feel about the proposals. People have said to us many times that you haven't put this to members. So there is an improvement in the offer. It has changed from where it was. But the detrimental parts, the changes to our members' terms and conditions, their work-life balance, the safety regime that the company wants to make, the cut of inspections by 50%, all of that remains in place.
The government's also saying it has played its part in facilitating a new pay offer. Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove is insisting the government is not standing in the way of a settlement.
The whole approach that Rishi Sunak is taking as Prime Minister is exactly what the country wants. Someone who is calm, in control, someone who is always trying to make sure that we can bring people together rather than divide them.
Health officials have confirmed an 8th child has died while suffering from a strep A infection in recent weeks. They were a pupil at a primary school in Hampshire. Downing Street is urging parents around the country to learn about the disease's symptoms. The former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, says there's a greater pressure for change across the UK now than there was when he was in government. He's been speaking to LBC after publishing his report into the country's future. The current Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is backing the review, promising to abolish the House of Lords if he becomes Prime Minister. Gordon Brown told Andrew Marr the current setup isn't working well enough.
We need a new Whitehall and we need a new Westminster. And that's why our proposals are radical in changing the House of Commons and what it does, but also changing the second chamber and moving civil servants and agencies out of London.
And a 14-year-old girl has died in Germany while a 13-year-old is seriously injured after they were attacked by a man with a